We Need to Talk, Part 3. This is all about the question of what is and isn't dysphoria, and whether or not dysphoria is a requirement to consider yourself a transgender person. So let's start with an easy one, and that is, what is dysphoria? Specifically, gender dysphoria, and I think it's important to make that point because gender dysphoria is the topic that we're talking about right now. According to the Miller-Keane Encyclopedia and Dictionary of Medicine, gender dysphoria is unhappiness with one's biological sex or its usual gender role, with a desire for body and role of the opposite sex. Now, gender dysphoria is a very specific topic, isn't it? But whether or not that makes you transgender to have it or not have it is actually kind of an interesting conversation. And the reason is this. It depends on what definition of transgender you're using. Is gender dysphoria necessary to consider yourself trans? No, because transgender is an umbrella term that actually encompasses even transvestites and drag queens. Anybody who doesn't present the normal gender expectation for their assigned biological sex is usually considered transgender. Actually, the reality is wording really depends on you. Do you consider yourself a trans person? Then you probably are. Most people don't question their gender if they're cis. And what that means is they probably aren't trying to present as something other than what the expectation is for their gender. Gender is more of a spectrum, with extremely feminine or extremely masculine on one side. Most people will fall somewhere between those two.
This, of course, assumes the traditional gender expectations of feminine and masculine. It's unfortunately incredibly difficult to discuss matters of femininity and masculinity without using outdated terms for what is considered feminine and masculine. Wearing a dress isn't inherently feminine, and yet it is considered more feminine than wearing pants. So for the sake of explanation, I recorded this video using those somewhat traditional, if outdated, ideas.
It's very, very rare that even the most masculine person is going to be extremely full mask all the time, and it's very rare that even the most feminine person is going to be feminine all the time. I consider myself more feminine than not, but I have a tendency to enjoy things like cars and wearing jeans. I don't consider myself the sort who would wear dresses 24/7. And that's considered a more feminine aspect. That also leads to the question of what is and isn't feminine or masculine. So the question then becomes, are you trans if you don't have gender dysphoria? And this is actually a very hotly debated topic within the trans community. And there are a lot of people who are trans who say you should and must have dysphoria to be considered trans. And I think the problem there is gender dysphoria is more related to transsexualism. That is the specific desire to change one's body. That does not necessarily make you trans. Transsexual and transgender are actually different. And that's where part of the debate comes in too. Terminology regarding gender and gender identity are changing constantly. Our understanding of gender and what it is and what it isn't is always in flux. And there's a lot of debate between different groups of people about what is and isn't transgender. Who is transgender? Who is allowed to call themselves transgender? And at what point are you deserving of transition? These are all extremely controversial and debatable topics. But the question is ultimately up to the person to decide. If you're someone who doesn't fall within either of the gender spectrums, you probably are someone who's transgender. If you're someone who was born assigned one thing, but feels you're more of the other, you're probably transgender, even if you don't decide to do anything about it. The reality is you can be trans and never have a surgery. And the idea that you need to have a surgery to consider yourself trans, or you need to have dysphoria to consider yourself trans, are kind of problematic. Even if you have gender dysphoria, that doesn't inherently mean that you want to have surgery or that's something you have plans to do. There's plenty of trans people who have gender dysphoria who have no desire to really do anything about it. And the question of dysphoria also includes, what does that look like for individual people? Every person's dysphoria is different. Your transition is not my transition, and for that matter, your transgender experience and what that means to you is completely different than mine. For me, being trans means I desperately need to get SRS. I need to have these things changed. I need to make them better. But for me, dysphoria comes and goes, and it's not always as clear-cut as I think some people would like to believe. It isn't just this nagging feeling in the back of your mind that something's wrong, which is there, but there's also very specific dysphoric episodes. In the beginning of my transition, a lot of my dysphoric episodes were about my facial hair. I always felt very, very self-conscious. Even before I knew I was trans, I didn't like having facial hair. I didn't know at the time what that was, but as I grew older and as I realized I was trans, it became more and more of an issue. I wore makeup religiously just to hide it, and it wasn't until I got laser hair removal that I started to get relief from that particular portion of my gender dysphoria. The reality is, a lot of times, though, because I pass and because people always treat me as feminine, I don't think about my transition much. There are only a few specific circumstances where I get really uncomfortable, and I start to realize that the gender dysphoria is real and it's still very much there. Maybe I've found ways to ignore it, and maybe that's part of why I didn't realize it sooner. But the reality is, your transition experience, like I said, is different. It's not necessarily that you're going to have the same dysphoria. Nobody's dysphoria necessarily looks the same. And the reality, too, is that in the beginning, I didn't even view my feelings about myself as dysphoric. It never fit what I heard from other people about what gender dysphoria was supposed to look like. It wasn't necessarily exclusively, oh, I hate this part of my body for X reason. It was more that I was uncomfortable with the expectation of what being male-identified person meant. What I came to realize is that for me, I've never been more comfortable than as who I am now. Being Narcissa is the greatest gift I've ever given myself. But I realize that it took me a long time to come to terms with that fact, because originally I didn't really realize it. I thought my dislike of my body was more to do with my weight than my genitalia, because I really didn't interact with it much. For a long time, I didn't think of that as dysphoria, because again, I tried to ignore it as much as possible. What I realized was that my specific dysphoria and what that ends up looking like is very, very different from a lot of the things I had heard from other people. It's not always that frequent, and oftentimes it's not something that's so debilitating that I can't go to work, and I'm grateful for that. I rarely use alcohol to fix my feelings about dysphoria. There's only been one instance I can remember in the last 3 years that I used alcohol to cope with my dysphoria. That was a very bad dysphoric episode. Suffice it to say, dysphoria is different for everyone. It's not a requirement to consider yourself transgender, but I know a lot of people who are trans do have it. And I think it's kind of like the saying about witchcraft and Wicca. You don't necessarily have to be a witch to be a Wiccan, but you're probably a Wiccan if you're a witch. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed this video, please feel free to comment down below. Tell me, do you feel like dysphoria is necessary to consider oneself transgender? Thank you all so much for watching, and until next time, bye!